The Battle of Ia Drang, fought from November 14 to 18, 1965, marked a significant turning point in the Vietnam War, as it was the first major engagement between the United States Army and the North Vietnamese Army, PAVN. This battle not only set the tone for future combat operations but also had profound implications for military strategy on both sides. Background and context: the Ia Drang Valley, located in the central highlands of Vietnam, was strategically important due to its proximity to key supply routes and its role in the North Vietnamese strategy to cut South Vietnam in half. The battle unfolded during a period when U.S. involvement in Vietnam was escalating, with President Lyndon B. Johnson increasing troop deployments in response to growing tensions. Key players: U.S. forces. The battle involved the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore, Jr., who led approximately 1,000 troops into combat. North Vietnamese forces. The PAVN, under Colonel Nguyen Huy In, aimed to engage U.S. forces to gauge their capabilities and tactics. The battle unfolds. Initial engagements: the battle began with an air assault on landing zone, LZ X-ray, where U.S. troops were deployed via helicopters. This marked a significant use of air mobility in warfare, allowing rapid troop movements into hostile territory. However, the North Vietnamese quickly surrounded the landing zone with 3 regiments, leading to intense combat. LZ X-ray. The initial clash saw fierce fighting, with U.S. forces relying heavily on artillery and air support to repel PAVN assaults. LZ Albany. Following LZ X-ray, U.S. forces faced another ambush at LZ Albany, resulting in significant casualties. Tactics and strategies: the battle showcased contrasting military strategies. U.S. tactics. The Americans employed overwhelming firepower, including artillery bombardments and airstrikes from B-52 bombers. North Vietnamese tactics. The PAVN utilized guerrilla warfare techniques, engaging U.S. troops at close quarters to negate the advantages of American artillery and air support. Casualties and aftermath: the toll of the battle was staggering. U.S. casualties: 234 American soldiers were killed and over 240 wounded. PAVN casualties: estimates suggest that between 1,800 and 3,500 North Vietnamese soldiers were killed. Both sides claimed victory, however. The psychological impact of the battle was profound. For the U.S., it validated an attrition strategy focused on inflicting higher casualties on the enemy than could be replaced. For North Vietnam, it demonstrated that they could engage U.S. forces directly and survive. Lessons learned: the Battle of Ia Drang had lasting implications for military strategy. U.S. military strategy. The high casualty rates led to increased troop deployments and a shift toward more aggressive search and destroy missions. North Vietnamese strategy. The PAVN recognized that direct confrontations could yield significant advantages if they adapted their tactics effectively. Strategic outcomes: the battle influenced future engagements throughout the Vietnam War. It reinforced U.S. reliance on air mobility and firepower while highlighting vulnerabilities in conventional tactics against a determined enemy. It shaped North Vietnamese strategies to avoid large-scale confrontations in favor of guerrilla tactics that would prolong the conflict. The Battle of Ia Drang stands as a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War, illustrating the complexities of modern warfare and the challenges faced by both sides. It served as a grim reminder of the costs of war and set a precedent for future engagements as both American and North Vietnamese leaders recalibrated their strategies based on the lessons learned from this brutal confrontation. As we reflect on Ia Drang, we recognize not just a clash of arms but a profound human experience that shaped generations. The bravery displayed by soldiers on both sides serves as a testament to their commitment to their respective causes amidst one of history's most contentious conflicts. The Battle of Ia Drang, fought between November 14 and 18, 1965, was a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War, marking the first major engagement between U.S. forces and the North Vietnamese Army, PAVN. This battle not only showcased the evolving nature of warfare but also highlighted key tactics employed by U.S. forces that would shape military strategy in Vietnam and beyond. Overview of the battle. The battle occurred in the Ia Drang Valley, a strategically significant area in the central highlands of Vietnam. The U.S. forces, primarily from the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, were tasked with conducting search and destroy missions against PAVN units that had been moving into South Vietnam. The engagement at Ia Drang was characterized by intense fighting at two main landing zones, LZX-Ray and LZ Albany. Key tactics used by U.S. forces. 1. Air mobility. One of the most significant tactics employed by U.S. forces during the Battle of Ia Drang was air mobility. This approach involved using helicopters to rapidly deploy troops into combat zones, allowing for quick insertion and extraction. Helicopter assaults. The use of helicopters enabled U.S. troops to bypass difficult terrain and engage the enemy directly. At LZX-Ray, for example, troops were airlifted in under heavy bombardment, allowing them to establish a foothold quickly before PAVN forces could fully respond. Rapid redeployment. Helicopters also facilitated rapid redeployment of forces within the battlefield, enabling U.S. commanders to respond swiftly to changing conditions on the ground. 2. Close air support. U.S. forces relied heavily on close air support to bolster their ground operations. This tactic involved coordinating airstrikes to provide immediate assistance to troops engaged in combat. Artillery and airstrikes. Before troops were inserted at LZX-Ray, extensive artillery barrages and airstrikes were conducted to soften enemy positions. This bombardment aimed to disrupt PAVN formations and reduce their effectiveness during initial engagements. B-52 bombing runs. The battle also marked one of the first uses of B-52 bombers in a tactical support role, delivering devastating strikes against enemy concentrations. 3. Firepower concentration. The U.S. military strategy at Ia Drang emphasized overwhelming firepower as a means of achieving tactical superiority. Artillery support. U.S. forces utilized artillery units positioned behind their lines to provide continuous support during engagements. This included firing on enemy positions that threatened U.S. troops at both LZX-Ray and LZ Albany. 36. Broken arrow calls. During intense fighting, particularly at LZX-Ray, U.S. commanders issued broken arrow calls, which requested immediate air support from all available aircraft in the area. 2. This tactic ensured that U.S. troops received critical fire support when under severe threat. 4. Search and destroy missions. The overarching strategy employed by U.S. forces involved conducting search and destroy missions, aimed at locating and neutralizing enemy forces. Engagement with PAVN forces. The aim was not only to inflict casualties but also to disrupt PAVN operations within South Vietnam. The battle was part of a broader campaign to secure the Central Highlands and eliminate North Vietnamese strongholds. Intelligence gathering. Prior intelligence indicated significant PAVN troop movements in the area, prompting U.S. forces to engage proactively rather than reactively. 5. Terrain utilization. U.S. commanders made strategic use of the terrain during battles at Ia Drang, establishing defensive positions. At both landing zones, U.S. Forces sought to establish defensive perimeters that leveraged natural terrain features for cover against PAVN assaults. Ambush awareness. Although initially caught off guard at LZ Albany, U.S. forces adapted quickly by using their mobility to reposition and counterattack against ambushing PAVN units. Outcomes and lessons learned. The Battle of Ia Drang resulted in significant casualties on both sides, with estimates suggesting over 300 American soldiers killed and thousands of North Vietnamese casualties. Both sides claimed victory. However, it became evident that while U.S. tactics had inflicted heavy losses on the PAVN, they also highlighted vulnerabilities in American strategy. Implications for future engagements. The tactics used during this battle set a precedent for future military operations in Vietnam. Validation of air mobility. The success of helicopter assaults demonstrated the effectiveness of air mobility as a combat tactic that would be used extensively throughout the war. Adapting strategies. North Vietnamese forces learned from their engagements at Ia Drang, adapting their tactics to avoid prolonged confrontations with superior firepower by engaging at close range. The Battle of Ia Drang was not just a clash of arms but a significant learning experience for both U.S. and North Vietnamese forces. The tactics employed by U.S. forces: air mobility, close air support, concentration of firepower, search and destroy missions, and terrain utilization, shaped military strategy throughout the Vietnam War and influenced future conflicts around the world. In reflecting on this battle, we recognize its importance in understanding modern warfare's complexities and challenges, as well as the profound human costs associated with such engagements. The lessons learned from Ia Drang continue to resonate within military circles today as they inform strategies for engaging asymmetric threats globally. The Battle of Ia Drang, fought from November 14 to 18, 1965, served as a critical juncture in the Vietnam War, marking the first significant engagement between U.S. forces and the North Vietnamese Army, PAVN. The battle's outcome and the lessons learned from it prompted a strategic shift for the North Vietnamese forces, who adapted their military approach in response to the realities of combat against a technologically superior adversary. This speech will explore in detail how the North Vietnamese adapted their strategy following the Battle of Ia Drang, focusing on several key areas: tactical adjustments, organizational changes, psychological warfare, logistical improvements, and the overarching strategic vision that guided their efforts throughout the war. Introduction. The Battle of Ia Drang was characterized by intense fighting and high casualties on both sides. U.S. forces employed air mobility and overwhelming firepower to inflict significant losses on the PAVN. However, despite suffering heavy casualties, estimated at around 1,800 to 2,000 killed, the North Vietnamese emerged from the battle with crucial insights that would shape their military strategy for the remainder of the conflict. This speech will delve into how these insights influence their tactics and overall approach to warfare. Tactical adjustments. Emphasis on close-quarter combat. One of the most significant adaptations made by North Vietnamese forces was a shift towards close-quarter combat. During the Battle of Ia Drang, U.S. troops utilized air support and artillery to devastating effect. The PAVN quickly recognized that engaging U.S. forces at a distance allowed American firepower to dominate the battlefield. Hugging tactics. To counteract this advantage, North Vietnamese soldiers began employing hugging tactics, engaging U.S. forces at very close range to minimize the effectiveness of artillery and air strikes. By staying close to American troops during engagements, they could reduce their exposure to aerial bombardment. Ambush strategies. The PAVN also adopted ambush tactics that involved using small units to strike quickly and retreat before U.S. forces could mount a coordinated response. These hit-and-run tactics became a hallmark of North Vietnamese operations throughout the war. Avoidance of conventional battles following Ia Drang. North Vietnamese leaders recognized that direct confrontations with U.S. forces were costly and often resulted in heavy losses. Guerrilla warfare. The PAVN increasingly relied on guerrilla warfare methods that emphasized mobility and stealth over head-on assaults. This approach allowed them to engage U.S. forces on their terms. Choosing when and where to fight. Small unit actions instead of large-scale engagements. North Vietnamese commanders focused on small unit actions that could inflict damage without exposing their forces to overwhelming American firepower. Organizational changes. Integration of regular and irregular forces. The aftermath of Ia Drang prompted a re-evaluation of how North Vietnamese forces organized themselves for combat. Unified command structure. The PAVN improved its command structure by integrating regular army units with local guerrilla forces, Viet Cong, allowing for more coordinated operations across different types of engagements. Standardization of equipment. The North Vietnamese also standardized their equipment supply chains, ensuring that both regular and irregular units had access to similar weaponry and resources. This included a focus on acquiring effective small arms like AK-47s and RPGs. Increased training and recruitment. In light of the lessons learned from Ia Drang, North Vietnam ramped up its training programs for soldiers. Training cadres. Thousands of northern cadres were sent south as leaders and trainers for local forces, enhancing combat effectiveness through improved tactics and strategies. Mass mobilization. The North Vietnamese government implemented policies aimed at mass mobilization for military service, ensuring a steady influx of new recruits into both regular army units and guerrilla groups. Psychological warfare propaganda campaigns. North Vietnamese leaders understood that psychological warfare was as crucial as physical confrontations. Morale building. Following Ia Drang, they intensified propaganda efforts aimed at both soldiers and civilians to bolster morale. Emphasizing victories, even in battles with heavy losses, helped maintain public support for the war effort. Demoralization of U.S. forces. The PAVN sought to exploit any signs of American vulnerability or dissent regarding the war effort through targeted propaganda campaigns aimed at undermining U.S. troop morale. Encouraging defections. Recognizing that undermining enemy strength could be achieved through attrition rather than direct confrontation. North Vietnam developed strategies to encourage defections among South Vietnamese troops. Defection programs. Initiatives were launched to persuade South Vietnamese soldiers to defect by highlighting disillusionment with their government or appealing to nationalist sentiments. Psychological operations. These included leafleting campaigns and radio broadcasts aimed at sowing doubt among South Vietnamese troops about their chances against a determined enemy. Logistical improvements. Enhanced supply lines. The Battle of Ia Drang underscored the importance of logistics in sustaining military operations. Ho Chi Minh Trail. After Ia Drang, North Vietnam expanded its use of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex network of supply routes through Laos and Cambodia, to ensure that troops in South Vietnam received necessary supplies without relying solely on fixed bases. Logistical flexibility. By improving logistics, North Vietnam could sustain prolonged engagements while minimizing exposure to American air power. Use of camouflage and deception to counteract American air superiority. North Vietnamese forces became adept at camouflage and deception techniques. Concealment tactics. Troops learned how to hide movements from aerial surveillance by using natural terrain features effectively. Deceptive practices. They employed decoys and misinformation strategies to mislead U.S. intelligence about troop movements and supply routes. Strategic vision, long-term commitment. The leadership in Hanoi recognized that victory would require patience and a long-term commitment rather than quick victories through conventional means. Protracted warfare strategy. Following Ia Drang, North Vietnam adopted a protracted warfare strategy based on Maoist principles, engaging in a war of attrition where time favored them against an adversary perceived as impatient. Waiting out U.S. resolve. Leaders like Ho Chi Minh believed that if they could maintain their resolve while inflicting casualties on U.S. forces, American public opinion would eventually turn against continued involvement in Vietnam. Coordination with international allies. North Vietnam sought greater cooperation with international allies who could provide support against U.S. forces. Soviet support. Increased military aid from the Soviet Union included advanced weaponry such as surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, that improved air defense capabilities. Chinese assistance. China also provided logistical support and training for North Vietnamese troops, enhancing their operational effectiveness against U.S. forces. The Battle of Ia Drang served as a catalyst for significant changes in North Vietnamese military strategy, through tactical adjustments emphasizing guerrilla warfare. Organizational improvements integrating regular and irregular forces, enhanced psychological operations, logistical innovations, and a long-term strategic vision rooted in patience and resilience. The PAVN adapted effectively to counteract U.S. advantages in technology and firepower. These adaptations not only allowed them to continue fighting but ultimately contributed to their success in achieving victory in 1975. As we reflect on these developments following one of the war's critical battles, it is essential to recognize how adaptability in strategy can influence outcomes in conflict, a lesson that remains relevant across various military engagements today. The Battle of Ia Drang, fought from November 14 to 18, 1965. Marked a significant turning point in the Vietnam War and was notable for being the first large-scale helicopter air assault in military history. The role of helicopters during this battle was pivotal, transforming the nature of warfare and setting a precedent for future operations. This speech will explore in detail the various aspects of helicopter operations during the Battle of Ia Drang, including their tactical employment, logistical capabilities, impact on troop movements, and the strategic implications that arose from their use. Introduction. The introduction of helicopters into combat operations represented a revolutionary shift in military tactics. The U.S. Army's 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, utilized helicopters not only for troop transport but also for providing fire support and logistical resupply. This battle showcased the effectiveness of air mobility in a dense jungle environment, where traditional ground movements were often hindered by challenging terrain. Overview of the battle. The Battle of Ia Drang consisted of two main engagements centered around two helicopter landing zones, LZs, LZ X-Ray and LZ Albany. The U.S. forces aimed to conduct search and destroy operations against North Vietnamese Army, PAVN, units that had been moving into South Vietnam. The battle began with an airmobile assault that involved inserting troops via helicopters into contested areas. Tactical employment of helicopters. Initial assault and insertion. The initial phase of the battle involved the use of helicopters to insert troops into LZ X-Ray. The operation began with artillery bombardments to soften enemy positions before troop insertion. Helicopter insertion. 16 1 Iroquois helicopters, commonly known as Hueys, were used to transport Bravo Company to LZX-ray. The helicopters provided rapid insertion capabilities, allowing U.S. forces to establish a presence in enemy territory quickly. Supportive fire. Helicopter gunships provided suppressive fire during troop insertions, helping to protect landing zones from enemy fire. This combination of air support and troop transport was critical in establishing a foothold in hostile territory. Continuous air support throughout the battle. Helicopters played a crucial role in providing continuous air support to ground troops. Close air support. Helicopters were equipped with machine guns and rockets, allowing them to engage enemy forces directly. This close air support was vital during intense firefights when ground troops faced overwhelming odds. Rapid response. The ability to quickly reposition helicopters allowed commanders to respond to changing battlefield conditions rapidly. When Bravo Company found itself under heavy attack, additional helicopter support was called in to assist. Medical evacuations. One of the most critical roles helicopters played during the Battle of Ia Drang was in medical evacuations. Dust-off missions. Medical evacuation. Dust-off missions were conducted using helicopters to transport wounded soldiers from the battlefield to medical facilities. This capability significantly increased survival rates for injured troops. Timely response. The speed at which helicopters could extract wounded soldiers ensured that they received timely medical attention, which was crucial given the severity of injuries sustained during combat. Logistical capabilities. Resupply operations. Helicopters facilitated logistical operations that were essential for sustaining combat effectiveness during the battle. Transporting supplies. Helicopters transported ammunition, food, and medical supplies directly to troops engaged in combat. This capability allowed U.S. forces to maintain operational momentum without being hindered by supply line vulnerabilities. Artillery support. Helicopters also played a role in transporting artillery pieces and other heavy equipment closer to the front lines, enabling more effective fire support during engagements. Challenges faced. Despite their advantages, helicopter operations were not without challenges during the Battle of Ia Drang. Vulnerability. Helicopters faced significant risks from enemy fire, particularly as they approached landing zones. Several helicopters were hit during insertions and resupply missions. Altitude limitations. The high altitude and dense jungle terrain limited helicopter performance, affecting their payload capacity and maneuverability. Impact on troop movements. Enhanced mobility. The use of helicopters fundamentally changed how U.S. forces maneuvered on the battlefield. Rapid deployment. Troops could be deployed rapidly across difficult terrain, allowing for quick strikes against enemy positions. This mobility was especially important in the rugged landscape of Vietnam. Flexible command structure. Commanders could reposition forces quickly based on real-time intelligence, adapting their strategies as situations evolved on the ground. Establishing defensive perimeters. After initial insertions, U.S. forces used helicopters to establish defensive perimeters around landing zones. Reinforcement capabilities. Helicopters allowed for rapid reinforcement of units engaged in combat. As Bravo Company faced mounting pressure from PAVN forces, additional companies were flown in to bolster defenses. Strategic positioning. By utilizing helicopter insertions effectively, U.S. commanders could position troops strategically around key locations, enhancing their defensive capabilities against PAVN assaults. Strategic implications. Blueprint for future operations. The success of helicopter operations during the Battle of Ia Drang set a precedent for future military engagements throughout the Vietnam War. Airmobile warfare doctrine. The lessons learned from Ia Drang influenced U.S. military doctrine regarding airmobile warfare. Subsequent operations increasingly relied on air mobility as a core component of tactical planning. Integration with air support. The integration of helicopter-borne troops with close air support became standard practice in later engagements, enhancing overall combat effectiveness. Psychological impact. The presence of helicopters also had psychological implications for both U.S. forces and their adversaries. Morale boost. For American soldiers, the rapid insertion and extraction capabilities provided by helicopters boosted morale by ensuring timely support and resupply. Intimidation factor. The sound of approaching helicopters became synonymous with American military power, instilling fear among PAVN troops who recognized their vulnerability to aerial assaults. In conclusion, helicopters played an indispensable role during the Battle of Ia Drang, transforming military tactics and strategies in unprecedented ways. Their ability to provide rapid troop insertions, continuous air support, medical evacuations, and logistical resupply fundamentally altered how battles were fought in Vietnam. The lessons learned from this engagement not only shaped subsequent U.S. military operations throughout the Vietnam War but also influenced global military strategies involving air mobility for decades to come. As we reflect on this pivotal moment in history, it is essential to recognize how technological advancements like helicopter warfare can redefine combat dynamics and impact outcomes on the battlefield.